Zach. We are at Chat Funnel Demand Gen Summit. I want to give the audience a little bit of a setup for us. So you and I went to college together. We both studied theater and creative arts. And then we were close friends. And then you went into the publishing field and illustration field, and I went into software sales and software marketing. We found each other again about 6-7 years ago. And for the last 7 years, we've been working in software together in marketing. And we have literally spent hundreds of hours debating, talking about storytelling, persuasion, rhetoric, narrative, all with this attempt to, I think, be more persuasive in arguments that marketing organizations are trying to make, sales organizations are trying to make, outbound sellers. Like I'm trying to get people to be more persuasive. And yet it feels like the messaging that I see on most companies' websites, the pitches that I see from salespeople, like tend toward blah. They tend toward mediocrity. And so it's been a passion of mine. What is your kind of hot take on this topic? Because you and I have been talking about this forever.
Sure.
Like you come at it, I think, from a little bit different perspective.
Right. I think what you've seen in the past, 3 or 4 years is an explosion of writing about storytelling and captivating people, and yet the quality of the ads and the blogs and the presentations and the websites, it's not much better rhetorically. I think the problem is a lack of either. There's a couple things. One, there's a misunderstanding of how our rational aspect relates to our emotional aspect. Broadly, there's a lack of harmony to messages. There's also a lack of hierarchy to messages, a failure to break things into big, small, and medium categories so that we can process things. And then there's the subsequent problem of the way that business language uses words in kind of a faddish way to chase whatever the fad is. And story becomes a popular word, and then it gets stretched out of all proportion so that it doesn't fit anything anymore. And people are talking about story and applying it to, data sheets and other things where there is nothing that resembles a story.
Okay, so you're talking about two things that I want to hit on if we can remember them. One is you mentioned the rational and the emotional.
Right.
And then two, we're talking about the broadening of the definition of story. Which one do you want to hit first? Because I'm interested in both.
Well, I think the rational emotional thing is upstream, I should say, of story. If you've listened to any podcast, so Daniel Kahneman did a book a couple years ago called Thinking, Fast and Slow. Mm-hmm. And he proposes, through his research, he wins the Nobel Prize in psychology. He studies the way people make decisions. He's a very authoritative guy. And he does a lot of research and finds that people have a quick way of thinking and a slow way of thinking. The quick way is our impulses, our intuitions. It's that stuff that sort of hits you all at once. And then there's a slow way of thinking, which is what we think of when we think of thinking. It's rational, it's focused, it's analytical. And if you've listened to sort of the photocopy of a photocopy version of his thesis on like a podcast, what you might hear is that we make decisions with emotion and then we rationalize after. And that is a false characterization of his argument. And in fact, it's, I think, part of why you're seeing a lack of harmony on, I'll give you an example. Let me say what he says first. And then, so what he actually says in his book is that quick way of thinking, your intuitions, your impulses, your emotions, has to then be ratified by your slow way of thinking for you to be persuaded. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't endorse your quick way of thinking, then you don't leave persuaded. Right. But what people are doing is they're proposing a kind of a Freudian notion that we're just governed by desire and reason is an illusion. It's not something real. And so, for example, I had an interview for a job a couple of years ago, and I went on the website of the company. Now I won't say who the company was, and they don't use this line anymore.
You can if you want. It's not.
So it was it was a content management system. And they said that they were the world's #1 storytelling platform. And I think that's captivating, interesting. And I thought, how in the world are they the world's #1 storytelling platform? So I went to look for any support for that statement, and there was none. Not on their YouTube channel, not on their website. It was just something that they threw out there thinking that that's going to emotionally engage people, and then it's done. The work is done. People are persuaded now.
Right.
And what you have to, and the tragedy of that is that there's actually a really good rational support for that. You could say that information unorganized is boring, it's uninteresting. Every story is information organized. They organize information to help your company tell a story. Like, they could do any of that stuff. They didn't. They chose not to.
Right.
They chose just to say the line and then abandon it and not support it. So that's what I think. There's a lack of harmony to understanding that our quick emotional sort of way of thinking has to correspond to our slower analytical reason. And you're seeing a lack of harmony. You're seeing a lot of flash and not a lot of reasoned support.
Okay, so that's interesting because my take is different. I was in Austin, Texas last week, and I was doing a session for sales leaders on using storytelling principles to drive like outbound messaging to try to generate more interest for your business with your SDRs and your AEs and your sales folks. And the thing I was arguing was that emotion has been lost in the argument. That what we're doing is part of the reason why it feels mediocre is that we have a website or we have a sales presentation. We show, the statistics, we show the social proof from like customers, but we are failing to enhance the problem statement. Like for some reason, we're afraid to talk about pain. Like we go right to solution. And to me, the pain has to connect to an emotional response that then I want to ratify with statistics, with a rational argument. So do you agree with that? Like, or do you separate, like, because to me, pain is what's missing. We're not being painful enough, and you don't have a good story unless you've got pain.
Well, I think I sort of agree, and sort of, well, here's how I would frame it. And this would support maybe our diverging views, but there's something to what you say, certainly. And it depends where in the business you're looking, because some people are, they just have, a good image or a very rhythmic soundtrack or something like that, and they feel like that's going to supply the emotional piece. And an emotional hook that is ratified is going to be more emotional, right? It's going to be better. I think so I would say it this way. We're living in a new romantic era that thinks it's a rationalist era.
Thinks it's rational.
Yeah.
Thinks it's rational.
Right, right. And the failure of, so romantic, capital R, like the romantic movement, right? Not like Valentine's Day. So I think the problem that you're seeing is a failure to care about the reasonable piece that much.
Okay.
And the reasonable piece requires hierarchy to be processable by the brain.
Okay, so when I'm thinking of emotion, I'm thinking of like the book Challenger Sale, which a lot of sales organizations adopted, which had a lot of really good data points talking about what the best salespeople do to make an argument. And the big thing was they're able to take you down a painful track using data and emotional impact to make you feel bad in order to then start to show you a new way. I think what you're arguing is that in this romantic era, we're making emotional statements that then are unsupported, and there's no need to even try. Like you said earlier, if I say that we're a storytelling platform, and then I don't pay it off, like we're like that's enough.
Well, it's two things. Like you're finding this in persuasion books where they're saying speak to the lizard part of a person's brain, and they're going to be all the way there. If you put a picture of a woman on your your bank newsletter, accounts are going to go up, right? You're going to get more, and so there's not even much of a desire to appeal to ratifying those stuff. But I would say, so going back to because we're in a romantic era, in order to swim in the waters in which we live, you need an emotional component for sure.
Right.
But because you want to stand out, you need a rational, for no other reason,
Right.
you need a rational ratification.
Okay, so
it just so happens, I would say, it just so happens that also is the way that the human brain works. So you get another bump.
So because we want to pay this off for the audience in some way. It feels like there's a truth there that needs to get hit, which is you need I've heard it said product truth, right?
Yeah.
But so you need an emotional argument to cause pain for your audience, for them to feel compelled to then have a rational argument that's hopefully ethical and right, that your product or service, it's paid off. So that's my side
Sure.
of the stance, is that you need the emotion that and the mediocrity that I see in web and sales presentations is that we're just going right to a rational argument. But you're saying we're misappropriating emotion. Like we're trying to manipulate sometimes with like an emotional, catchy phrase, and then we're not even paying it off.
Right. I think that the classic dispute in rhetoric between there are two factions. It's the truth faction and the power faction. And power is a very big part of marketing, where they don't mind manipulating people, or they don't mind being a little bit less than honest, as long as they're sort of accruing power. Whereas that's always a short-term game. The longer-term game is if you speak the truth beautifully, you get power in the long run, but it's sort of a secondary effect. It's not your primary pursuit. And the other, I think part of the problem that even we're having in this conversation is that we're seizing on these particulars. One of the reasons that story is valuable is that it harmonizes those particulars into a structure that people resonate and recognize. So it's like the difference between if you gave me a bunch of tennis balls, maybe I could hold 10, or maybe I could hold 15 or something, right?
Or 16.
Or 16 perhaps.
Yeah.
But if you gave me a bucket, I could put 20,
right.
And it'd be easy. Right. So what a story does is it harmonizes all these particular pieces so that you can hold. So particularly for products that are complicated, processes that are complicated, other abstract concepts, if you can group them into a story, then you can make them comprehensible. And also you create a hierarchy, because a story has an internal mechanism that tends to organize things, and it wants to be arranged as rising action, where it starts small and gets bigger.
Okay, so here's my fear. You and I, we nerd out on terms like rhetoric, which sounds like I'm back in college doing a term paper, or narrative. And then there's this weird, broad definition of story, right? There are these terms that and we interchange them a lot. So when you're talking to an audience like this, and tomorrow I've got to go out and make a pitch, or I've got to send an outbound message, or I'm trying to create web copy that is, to me, again, ultimately persuasive and truthful, how would you guide simply an audience through, because you've just talked about harmony and hierarchy.
Yeah.
The hierarchy brings complicated ideas, these disparate parts, and brings them into some unity. So how would we start to land this plane?
Let's look at, so when there's no hierarchy, let's just, for a second,
to give an example,
everybody's been to a demo that's bad.
Okay, give it, perfect example. So give it a bad demo. What does that look like?
And when there's no hierarchy in the demo, every button is as important as every other button. And nobody can process the amount of information that happens in the demo. And frequently it seems, and this might be uncharitable, but it seems as though the solution consultant or whoever's running the demo is just trying to impress you that they know a lot about tech.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so and in fact, like, it's almost like the reason that interpretation exists is because the less you comprehend, the more their status raises. Right. And
I don't think that's intentional.
It might not be intentional, and it might not even be true, but it's just there's so much confusion when you don't have any hierarchy, when everything is as important as everything else. If you say, though, everything in our product does one of two things. It's either going to do this or it's going to do this. And then now I'm going to explain these two big categories. I'm going to a layer deeper. And then we're going to have even a layer deeper. It's the way that you group information naturally with a grocery list or with acronyms or anything like that lets you process them. It's why nobody says NASA, they say NASA,
Right.
Because that's sort of a grouping that we process as one thing, not 4 separate letters.
Yep.
So anyway, that's just the way the brain works. So I would say we've seen what happens when you don't have any hierarchy. The reason story is a good tool is because it introduces hierarchy.
Okay, so I think this is really good for the audience because you do see. I think the demo example is good because I think the audience, all of us, we receive demos and we do demos. And you get on there, and it does feel like there's just like a straight line of buttons and features and things. And it's up to me to categorize those in a way to make it have meaning, and that's what makes it feel mediocre because I'm having to go to pains to try to group it myself. And I think what you're arguing, I think, is that harmony. Am I saying this right? Harmony comes from a proper hierarchy of what is the most important thing I'm going to show you in a pitch, on my marketing site, on my demo, on my presentation, and order the loves. Like we really love this, and we also love this, and then we love.
Yeah, everybody loves the same things, but when in conflict, we love this more than we love this. And the order of our loves defines the character of the person or the product or the company or whoever. That hierarchy introduces comprehensibility on things that are not easy to comprehend at first blush. So I think the harmony is important. Going back to your other question though about so the story, there's a lot of story principles, and there's even within, if you're just a writer and you're just writing short stories or plays or something like that, there's a lot of variance in story structure and storytelling.
Yep.
And you've got 3 acts and 5 acts and so on. I think for sales in particular, the 3-act structure is good for presentation or for long form content. I think sales probably should focus on a 1-act structure with no ending.
Okay. Because
you don't want the audience to feel catharsis. You want them to feel kind of the cliffhanger, what do I do next?
Right. And that's the pain though.
It's an unresolved pain. But you probably introduced the pain
that will
earlier.
lead you to the next meeting potentially, or the next conversation, because you've left me in a place where I feel emotionally compelled to keep going instead of going, all right, I'll talk to the next vendor.
Right. So the good thing about every 1 act is that it's essentially, the first act is essentially the same in every story structure, whether it's 3 acts or 7 acts or 1 act, and you have just a few things that help to govern it. The first is you have to define who the hero is of the story, the protagonist, and then you have to recognize the pattern of their behavior, that there's some pattern, that something they do every day.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's an interruption in their pattern caused by internal or external forces, right? So
that's the pain.
That's the pain. And you have to address the pain or not address the pain. Mm. And so you have to either, the calculation is worth the risk or it's not. So it's either jump into the boat,
right?
Or it's I'll take my chances. Hopefully somebody else will come before the boat sinks.
So we've got I think 2 minutes.
All right.
So if I'm summing up what we're talking about, one is that it seems like emphasizing, not necessarily emotion, but emphasizing the pain clearly. It seems like 2, having a hierarchy in if your product does 5 things, you need to have an order of loves in which, when you're addressing the pain, the solution points to the highest love, secondary love, third, in a way,
or group it in big, medium, small. What's most important.
Right.
Now,
so you have to hierarchy, and then I think what you're saying is then harmonize how those disparate parts, even if they're great features or capabilities,
sure,
how they come together to solve that pain that we have caused. Is that
yes, harmonize the particulars. Sometimes the story helps you do that, but also, more importantly, I think, rhetorically, is to harmonize the way that fast thinking and slow thinking have to coordinate, so that you're not just, what's the most emotional thing we can say about our product? It's, what's the most emotional thing that's supported as a solution or anything else by our product.
Okay, cool. This has been really fun. I appreciate your time, and I hope everyone at ChatFunnel enjoys the Demand Gen Summit. We thank you for your time, and have a great conference.
Thanks very much.